The briefing room fell into an uneasy silence when she walked in. Officers shifted in their seats, exchanging glances that carried the weight of skepticism and something darker, the kind of doubt that clings to anyone who doesn't fit the mold. Major Kira Volkov moved to the front with measured steps, her flight suit worn but immaculate, patches faded from years under unforgiving suns. She carried no bravado, no theatrical confidence, just the quiet certainty of someone who had already survived what most feared. The base commander, General Marcus Hale, a man whose chest displayed 3 rows of ribbons earned across 2 decades of conflict, studied her with narrowed eyes. His reputation preceded him, a tactician who valued results over politics, but also a traditionalist who believed combat aviation was a fraternity earned through blood and fire, not policy changes. "Major Volkov," he began, his voice cutting through the room's tension, "you've been assigned to lead the reconnaissance sortie over the Kavari Ridge. Intelligence suggests enemy SAM installations, possible air defense networks, high risk, minimal support." He paused, letting the weight settle. "Before we proceed, I need to know what you're bringing to this operation. What's your call sign?" The room seemed to lean forward. Call signs weren't just nicknames in military aviation. They were identities forged in crisis, shorthand for reputation. Every pilot in that room knew theirs carried stories of close calls, victories, or mistakes that defined them. Kira met the general's gaze without flinching. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed, casting harsh shadows across the maps and satellite imagery spread across the table. Outside, the distant whine of jet engines warming up on the tarmac provided a constant industrial heartbeat. "Specter 1," she said quietly. The reaction was immediate. A captain near the back stiffened. A lieutenant colonel's expression shifted from mild curiosity to something approaching recognition, then disbelief. General Hale's fingers, which had been drumming against the table, stopped. The name hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot, familiar to those who knew, invisible to those who didn't. Specter 1 wasn't just a call sign. It was a legend whispered in ready rooms and officer clubs, attached to missions that officially never happened, to targets that were never confirmed destroyed, to a pilot who had disappeared from service records 3 years ago after an operation in the Caspian theater went catastrophically wrong. "That's not possible," someone muttered from the back row. Kira didn't turn to identify the speaker. She kept her eyes on Hale, whose face had transformed from skeptical authority to something more complex, calculation mixed with what might have been respect, or perhaps wariness. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight, and folded his arms across his chest. "Prove it," he said simply. The challenge carried weight because everyone in that room understood what it meant. Call signs, especially legendary ones, couldn't be stolen or borrowed. They had to be earned, and more importantly, they had to be verified through shared knowledge that only those in the community would possess. Kira reached into her flight suit pocket and withdrew a small object, placing it on the table with a soft click that seemed impossibly loud in the silent room. It was a challenge coin, but not the standard commemorative type passed around like business cards. This one was scorched on one edge, the metal discolored from extreme heat. The insignia showed a ghostly aircraft silhouette over mountains, with coordinates etched along the rim. General Hale picked it up, turning it over in his fingers. His expression changed as he read the coordinates, numbers that corresponded to a location that didn't exist on any official map, a valley in the Zagros Mountains where, 3 years prior, a covert strike package had been ambushed by advanced enemy fighters. The mission had been scrubbed from records, the pilots reassigned or disappeared into black programs. Only 7 people had been issued these coins. 6 were confirmed dead. "You were flying the EA-18G," Hale said, not a question but a statement seeking confirmation. "The electronic warfare bird that kept the strike package alive long enough to egress." 68 minutes, Kira replied, "against 4 Su-35s and a SAM umbrella that wasn't supposed to be there. We lost 2 birds. The rest made it out because someone stayed behind to jam their targeting radars and feed false coordinates into their missile guidance systems. She paused, her voice carrying the weight of memory. I was that someone. The room's atmosphere shifted. Several officers who had been slouching sat straighter. A major who had been scrolling through a tablet set it down, full attention now focused forward. The story of the Zagros Valley ambush was known only in fragments, classified at levels that kept details from spreading. But among certain circles, among pilots who operated in the shadows of conventional warfare, it was mythology, the tale of a single aircraft that had turned a massacre into a survivable disaster through skill, audacity, and a willingness to accept fatal odds. Her aircraft took a missile hit. Another voice spoke up, Colonel Reeves, the wing commander, a woman whose own combat credentials were beyond dispute. Shoulder-launched SAM punched through your left engine. You should have ejected, but instead you flew for another 40 minutes on a dying turbine, drawing fire away from the egress corridor. She stood, moving closer to examine Kira with new eyes. We were told Specter 1 didn't make it out. The aircraft was tracked going down over enemy territory. I didn't make it out in the aircraft, Kira answered, but I made it out. The implications hung heavy. Survival, evasion, resistance, and escape. SEER wasn't just a training acronym but a lived hell that transformed those who endured it. The silence stretched as minds processed what wasn't being said. The days or weeks behind enemy lines, the exfiltration that must have been mounted, the debriefs and psychological evaluations that followed. And then the decision, likely not hers, to disappear from official records, to become a ghost in fact as well as call sign. General Hale set the challenge coin down, pushing it back toward Kira. The sortie over Kavari Ridge, he said, his tone completely changed, carrying now the weight of operational necessity tempered with something approaching deference. Intelligence is thin. We know there's SAM coverage but not the full network topology. Radar emissions suggest S-400 batteries, possibly integrated with shorter-range systems. The reconnaissance package needs electronic warfare support that can adapt in real time, someone who can read the battle space and make decisions faster than our adversaries can react. He gestured to the maps. You'll be flying solo escort for a 2-ship reconnaissance element. F-35s with targeting pods and signals intelligence packages. Your bird is an EA-18G Growler, recently updated with AN/ALQ-249 jamming pods. Your mission is to keep them alive long enough to map the enemy air defense network, identify gaps, and provide targeting data for follow-on strikes. Kira studied the maps, her eyes tracing terrain features and elevation lines, with the practiced efficiency of someone who could visualize 3-dimensional battle space from 2-dimensional representations. The Kavari Ridge was a 100-mile stretch of mountains straddling the border, perfect terrain for concealing radar installations and SAM batteries. Dense electronic warfare environment, minimal room for error, and if intelligence was wrong about force disposition, the mission could transition from reconnaissance to survival in seconds. Rules of engagement, she asked. Defensive only unless directly threatened, then weapons-free. Priority is intelligence gathering, not destruction. But if you assess that the reconnaissance birds can't complete the mission without eliminating specific threats, that call is yours. Hale's expression made clear he trusted her judgment, a remarkable concession for someone who moments ago had been a stranger walking into his briefing room. The mission brief continued with technical details, frequencies, backup communications protocols, search and rescue positioning, diplomatic considerations that constrained how deep they could penetrate, and what thresholds constituted acceptable escalation. Kira absorbed it all with the quiet focus of a professional, asking pointed questions that revealed her understanding of electronic warfare tactics and enemy doctrine. She wanted to know about recent enemy radar patterns, whether they'd shown adaptive behavior suggesting awareness of U.S. jamming techniques, what kind of fighter cover might be available from nearby air bases. Colonel Reeves provided tactical overlays, showing suspected SAM locations marked with confidence levels, red for confirmed, yellow for probable, gray for possible. The map looked like a constellation of threats, a web designed to create overlapping fields of fire that would force any aircraft into kill zones no matter which approach vector they chose. It was the kind of air defense network that professional militaries spent billions developing, designed by engineers who understood that American air power's greatest advantage was its ability to operate freely. Taking that freedom away leveled the playing field dramatically. Launches at 0400, Hale concluded. That gives you 6 hours to pre-flight your aircraft, review the latest intelligence updates and get your head right. Questions? Kira shook her head. She had everything she needed: a mission, an aircraft, and the trust of a general who now understood exactly who he was sending into harm's way. As the briefing broke up and officers filed out, several approached her with the subtle deference that combat veterans show to those whose reputations precede them. Not fawning admiration, but quiet acknowledgement. Colonel Reeves stopped beside her, studying the younger woman with an expression that mixed professional respect with personal curiosity. "I flew with someone who was in the Zagros Valley," Reeves said quietly, making sure the conversation stayed private. He said Specter 1 pulled off jamming patterns he'd never seen before or since, improvised in real time, like playing jazz against an orchestra trying to kill you. Said it was the most beautiful and terrifying flying he'd ever witnessed. She paused. He also said whoever was in that cockpit shouldn't have survived the missile hit, let alone kept fighting for another 40 minutes. "What kept you up there?" Kira's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes, not pride or bravado, but the simple truth that defines certain types of warriors. "They were counting on me," she said. "Everything else was irrelevant." The answer seemed to satisfy Reeves, who nodded once and departed. Kira remained in the briefing room for several minutes after everyone else had left, studying the maps and satellite imagery with an intensity that went beyond mere preparation. She was visualizing the mission in complete detail, anticipating decision points, wargaming scenarios where enemy actions would force rapid tactical adjustments. This was the mental preparation that separated adequate pilots from exceptional ones. The ability to pre-flight the mission, not just mechanically, but cognitively, building neural pathways that would activate under stress when conscious thought became too slow. Outside, dawn was still hours away. The base operated under minimal lighting protocols, reducing signature in case of hostile surveillance. Kira made her way to the flight line, her boots crunching on tarmac still damp from evening rain. The EA-18G Growler sat in its revetment, a two-seat variant of the FA-18 Super Hornet bristling with electronic warfare pods and antennas. It looked meaner than its fighter cousins, purpose-built for a mission that required both survivability and the ability to project invisible violence across the electromagnetic spectrum. The crew chief, a senior master sergeant with graying hair and hands scarred from decades of maintenance work, stood beside the aircraft with a tablet displaying pre-flight checklists. He looked up as Kira approached, his expression neutral until he caught sight of the patch on her flight suit, faded but still visible, showing a ghostly aircraft over mountains. Recognition transformed his weathered face. "Ma'am," he said, standing a bit straighter, "aircraft is fully mission capable. I supervise the upload personally. You've got full ammunition for the defensive systems. External fuel tanks are topped, and the jamming pods are calibrated to specifications you've probably forgotten more about than I'll ever know." There was respect in his voice, the kind that enlisted personnel reserve for officers who have proven themselves beyond the requirements of rank. Kira returned the greeting and began her walk-around inspection, checking control surfaces, examining the underwing stores, verifying that weapons and electronic warfare pods were properly mounted and armed. She moved with the methodical efficiency of someone who knew that pre-flight inspection wasn't mere procedure but survival insurance. that the 10 minutes spent examining your aircraft could mean the difference between landing safely and becoming a smoking crater. The sergeant watched her work with approval. "Heard you're flying solo escort for the reconnaissance package," he said conversationally, though his tone carried an undercurrent of concern. "That's asking a lot from one bird." "One bird with the right pilot," Kira replied without looking up from her inspection of the port-side jamming pod. "Besides, sometimes one aircraft is harder to track than a formation. Less electromagnetic signature, more unpredictability." She climbed the ladder to the cockpit, settling into the ejection seat with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent thousands of hours in similar positions. The interior was familiar yet different. New displays, updated interfaces, but the fundamental layout that came from decades of evolution in the Hornet family. She began the startup sequence, watching as systems came online one by one, each component reporting status through a cascade of readouts and indicators. The aircraft was awakening around her, becoming an extension of her will and capability. In the right seat, her weapons systems officer, a lieutenant named Alexei Tors who had been assigned that afternoon, completed his own checklist with quiet competence. He was young, probably mid-20s, with the kind of focused intensity that suggested he took his role seriously. His silence wasn't hostile or uncertain. He was simply allowing the pilot to establish her rhythm before inserting himself into the crew dynamic. "Tors," Kira said as the port engine spooled up, its turbine creating a rising whine that transformed into a steady roar. "You've done electronic warfare before." "To Tor, ma'am," he replied. "Mostly counter-IED jamming and ground support roles, some escort work for strike packages over less contested airspace. Nothing like what you did in Zagros Valley, but I know the systems and I can keep up." There was no false bravado in his voice, just honest assessment of his capabilities and acknowledgement that he was flying with someone whose reputation exceeded his experience. "Good," Kira said. "When we're in the weeds, I need you managing the threat display and calling out priorities. My focus will be on flying and overall tactics. You're my eyes on the electromagnetic spectrum. If you see something that doesn't make sense, speak up immediately. No hesitation, no second-guessing yourself." "Understood, ma'am." The starboard engine spooled up, and now the Growler sat on the tarmac like a leashed predator, power barely contained, waiting for release. Kira ran through final checks while listening to radio communications from the tower and other aircraft. The two F-35s she'd be escorting were still in their pre-flight sequences, their pilots working through the more complex systems that made fifth-generation aircraft both incredibly capable and maintenance-intensive. She would launch first, establish position in the operating area, and wait for them to join up before crossing into contested airspace. "Specter 1 Tower, you are cleared to taxi to runway 27, the air traffic controller's voice crackled through her helmet. "Winds are 260 at 8 knots. Altimeter 3017. Contact departure on button 4 after takeoff." "Specter 1 copies, taxi 27, Kira acknowledged. She released the brakes, and the Growler rolled forward with the heavy purposefulness of a fully loaded combat aircraft. The journey to the runway took several minutes, navigating taxiways and checking in with ground control, the routine aspects of flight operations that provided structure and safety protocols to what was fundamentally a dangerous enterprise. At the runway threshold, she performed final checks, control surfaces moving freely, instruments reading correctly, electronic warfare systems showing green across the board. Tors confirmed weapons status and verified that their data link connection to the F-35s and command center was active and encrypted. Everything was as ready as human preparation and mechanical precision could make it. "Specter 1 Tower, you are cleared for takeoff, runway 27, winds 265 at 10 knots. "Specter 1 cleared for takeoff." Kira advanced the throttles smoothly, feeling the engines respond with mounting thrust. The Growler accelerated down the runway, speed building through 50 knots, 80, 120. At 140 knots she rotated, pulling back on the stick, and the nose lifted as the aircraft transitioned from ground vehicle to flying machine. Landing gear came up with a solid thunk, and she established a climbing turn toward the east, where darkness still held dominion over the landscape but was slowly yielding to the approaching dawn. The flight to the operating area took 30 minutes, climbing to 25,000 feet and establishing a racetrack pattern while waiting for the F-35s to join. From this altitude, Kira could see the Kavari Ridge in the distance, a dark mass silhouetted against the lightening eastern sky. Somewhere in those mountains were the SAM batteries they sought, radar arrays sweeping the sky for targets, operators watching green screens and waiting for threats to materialize. It was a chess match played at the speed of modern warfare, where decisions measured in seconds determined who lived and who died. Specter 1, Raven flight checking in, a voice announced over the tactical frequency. The F-35s had launched and were climbing to join her. Their call signs were Raven 01 and Raven 02, pilots whose names she'd learned in the brief but whose capabilities were still unknown quantities. That was the nature of modern military aviation. You flew with whoever was assigned, trusted their training and professionalism, and hoped that when things went wrong, as they inevitably did, everyone would perform to the standards their wings and patches represented. Raven Flight Specter 1, good morning, Kira replied. I'm holding at Angels 25, coordinates as briefed. Weather is clear, wind from the west at 15 knots at altitude. We'll proceed to the target area in trail formation, 20-mile spacing. I'll take lead position and run initial radar mapping. Stay passive until I give the word. Raven Flight copies. The formation shaped up smoothly, and they turned toward the Kavari Ridge as dawn began painting the eastern sky in shades of orange and gold. It was a beautiful morning for flying, clear visibility and stable air that made aircraft handling precise and predictable. Beautiful mornings, Kira had learned, meant better conditions for everyone, defenders as well as attackers, missiles as well as aircraft. The pretty sunrise made targeting easier for the SAM operators, who would try to kill them in the next hour. As they approached the border of contested airspace, Kira activated her electronic warfare systems in passive mode, allowing the sensitive receivers to map enemy radar emissions without announcing their presence through active jamming. The threat display in her cockpit began populating with contacts, search radars sweeping methodically, fire control systems in standby mode, the electronic fingerprints of an integrated air defense network waiting for prey to enter its engagement envelope. Multiple search radars, Torres called out, his voice steady despite the threat density. S-400 acquisition radar bearing 090, estimated range 70 kilometers. Secondary contacts suggest shorter range systems filling gaps. This is denser than intelligence briefed. Copy, Kira acknowledged. She adjusted their approach vector, looking for a gap in coverage where they might penetrate deeper before triggering active defenses. The electronic warfare game was fundamentally about information, knowing where the enemy was before they knew where you were, understanding their capabilities well enough to exploit limitations. The S-400 system was one of the most capable SAMs ever developed, able to engage targets at ranges exceeding 200 miles and altitudes up to 100,000 feet. But it had blind spots, angles of approach where terrain masked radar returns, or where the curvature of the Earth kept low-flying aircraft under the horizon. Raven Flight, Specter 1, recommend we drop to 5,000 feet and use terrain masking for the initial approach. Stay tight to the valley floors and minimize radar cross-section. We'll pop up for mapping runs when we've identified gaps. Raven 01 copies descending. The three aircraft dropped altitude, descending into the mountain valleys as the sun crept higher, transforming the landscape from shadowy mystery to sharp detail. At 5,000 feet, they were below many of the radar horizon lines, trading safety and altitude for concealment. It was a calculated risk. Down here, if something went wrong, there was less time to react, less room to maneuver. But staying high meant earlier detection and longer engagement windows for enemy missiles. They flew in silence for several minutes, weaving through mountain valleys with tours continuously updating the threat picture as new radar emissions were detected and cataloged. The air defense network was more sophisticated than anticipated, showing coordination between systems that suggested active integration rather than independent operators. That meant somewhere in these mountains was a command center fusing data from multiple sensors, building a composite picture of airspace and directing fires to maximize effectiveness. New contact, Tors announced suddenly. Fire control radar bearing 045 high PRF were being painted. The tactical situation had just shifted from reconnaissance to active engagement. Somewhere ahead, an enemy radar operator had detected an anomaly in their returns and shifted from passive search to active targeting. Kira's hands moved across the cockpit controls with practiced speed, activating jamming systems and preparing defensive countermeasures. The electronic warfare pods under her wings began radiating energy, pumping electromagnetic noise into the enemy radar systems, attempting to blind or confuse them. Raven flight, go defensive, break formation, execute evasion pattern Delta, Kira ordered. The F-35 scattered, using their stealth characteristics and low radar cross-section to complicate the enemy targeting solution. Kira turned toward the threat, pointing her aircraft at the source of the fire control radar, a counterintuitive move that reduced her radar cross-section while allowing her jamming pods maximum effectiveness. Specter 1, Raven 01, we've lost the targeting solution. Can you suppress that radar? Working it, Kira replied. She adjusted jamming frequencies, feeding electronic noise into the enemy system while simultaneously analyzing its characteristics. The radar was operating in a frequency band that suggested it was paired with a medium-range SAM system, probably a Buck M3 or similar platform. Lethal against most aircraft, but vulnerable to sophisticated electronic attack if you knew its weaknesses. Tors worked his console frantically, building a detailed electronic picture of the threat and identifying optimal jamming patterns. I've got their operating frequency, ma'am. They're using frequency hopping to defeat standard jamming, but there's a pattern in their sequence. Predictable if you watch it long enough. How long did you watch? 20 seconds. That's enough. Kira adjusted her jamming pod output, synchronizing it to anticipate the enemy radar's frequency hops and inject false targets into their returns. The technique was called predictive jamming, and it required both sophisticated equipment and a weapons systems officer who could analyze patterns faster than the enemy could adapt. Tors had just proven he could keep up. The threat indicator showed the fire control radar going active, then dropping back to search mode as it lost track. The enemy operator was confused, seeing targets appear and disappear, unable to maintain the lock needed to guide a missile. Kira didn't wait for them to figure it out. She accelerated, climbing hard and fast, popping up above the ridgeline to give the F-35s a clear picture of what they'd come to map while simultaneously presenting herself as the most obvious target. Raven flight, you've got 2 minutes, she transmitted. Get your imagery and signals intelligence, then we're out of here. The F-35s went to work, their sensors sweeping across the valley floor and recording everything: radar emissions, heat signatures, photographic imagery of suspected SAM sites. This was what they'd come for, the intelligence that would enable future strikes by identifying exactly where enemy systems were positioned. But gathering intelligence required time, and time in a hostile air defense environment was measured in heartbeats. Missile launch, missile launch. Tor's voice cut through the tactical frequency, stripped of calm professionalism by genuine alarm. SAM inbound, bearing 030, close range. Kira didn't need to see the missile to react. Years of training and instinct compressed into immediate action, throttles forward, hard turn into the threat, punching out chaff and flares while simultaneously jamming the missile's guidance radar. The Growler shuddered through the violent maneuver, G-forces pressing her into the seat as the aircraft arced through the sky. Her vision narrowed slightly at the edges, blood draining from her head, but she maintained pressure on the stick, keeping the turn tight. Time to impact, she grunted through clenched teeth. 8 seconds, 7. She reversed the turn, braking the other direction, creating a flight path that no missile could follow efficiently. The SAM, committed to its previous intercept solution, tried to adjust but burned energy in the turn. At 4 seconds it lost track completely, confused by jamming and unable to reacquire. It detonated harmlessly 200 meters away, close enough that the aircraft rocked from the shockwave but far enough that shrapnel caused no damage. Missile defeated, Torres reported, his voice returning to something approaching calm. But they know exactly where we are now. Multiple fire control radars going active across the network. The electronic warfare display lit up like a Christmas tree, showing threat after threat coming online. The enemy had committed to engaging them, abandoning the patience of passive observation for active defense. It meant the reconnaissance mission had achieved its goal. They'd forced the enemy to reveal themselves. But it also meant the easy part was over. Raven Flight Specter 1, pack it up, we're departing now, Kira ordered. RTB Route Charlie, stay low, stay fast. I'll trail and keep them off your back. The F-35s didn't argue. They'd gotten what they came for, and survival was now the priority. They dropped back into the valleys, accelerating toward friendly airspace while Kira held position above them. A decoy and Guardian rolled into one. Her aircraft drew fire like a magnet, its electronic warfare systems broadcasting loudly across multiple frequencies, impossible to ignore. She was betting that enemy air defense commanders would prioritize the obvious threat, her, over the stealthier F-35s they could barely track. 2 more missiles launched, climbing on columns of white smoke. Kira defeated them through a combination of jamming, maneuvering, and expendables, each engagement draining her defensive systems and fuel reserves. Torres called out threats with machine-like precision, his initial nervousness burned away by the immediate demands of combat. He was proving himself in the fire, performing exactly as needed, and Kira made a mental note that if she survived this mission, she'd request him as permanent crew. Raven Flight is clear of the engagement zone, came the welcome transmission. The F-35s had made it to friendly airspace, their mission complete. Now Kira just had to extract herself from a very angry air defense network that had committed significant resources to killing her. She turned west, accelerating to maximum speed, trading altitude for velocity. The Growler shook as it approached its performance limits, engines howling, airframe stressed but holding. Behind her, radar systems tracked her departure, but they were losing lock as jamming and distance combined to degrade their solutions. One final missile launched, a last-ditch attempt to claim a kill, but it was fired at extreme range and ran out of energy before reaching her. 30 minutes later, Kira landed back at base as the sun reached its zenith, washing the runway in harsh white light. She taxied to the revetment in silence, engines winding down, the aircraft settling into stillness after the violence of the morning. The crew chief was waiting, his expression mixing relief and professional curiosity. Torres climbed down from the back seat looking pale but composed, the reality of how close they'd come to death settling into his bones. General Hale was waiting in the debrief room, along with intelligence officers eager to download the data from the mission. But before the technical assessment began, before the analysts started building target folders from the information gathered, Hale approached Kira privately. His expression had transformed from the skepticism of the morning brief to something different. Respect, certainly, but also a kind of vindication that comes from betting on someone and watching them deliver beyond expectations. Raven Flight confirms you saved their lives at least twice out there, he said quietly. Torres says you did things with electronic warfare he didn't know were possible. He paused, studying her with eyes that had seen decades of combat operations and learned to recognize exceptional talent. Specter 1 wasn't just a call sign. It was a warning I should have heeded sooner. You're exactly what we need for the main strike package. Kira met his gaze steadily. The reconnaissance mission was just mapping, sir. Taking those sites down is going to be significantly harder. They're integrated, adaptive, and they've got coverage that overlaps in ways that make simple penetration routes impossible. We'll need to coordinate simultaneous suppression from multiple vectors, overwhelm their command and control, and exploit the gaps that creates. Can it be done? Everything can be done, Kira replied. It's just a question of price. How many aircraft we're willing to risk, how much ordnance we're prepared to expend, how sophisticated we want the operation to be. She pulled out a tablet and began sketching a rough concept, showing ingress routes and jamming corridors. If I had 4 Growlers and a strike package of 12 aircraft, I could take that network apart in 40 minutes. If you give me 2 Growlers and 8 strike aircraft, it takes longer and gets riskier. 1 Growler, that's not a plan, that's suicide. Hale considered this assessment with the gravity it deserved. Military operations were always about resource allocation, balancing objectives against available forces and acceptable casualties. The Kavari Ridge Air Defense Network protected something important enough that the enemy had invested heavily in its defense. Taking it down would require similar investment from their side. I'll get you 3 Growlers and 16 strike aircraft, he said finally. Mission brief is tomorrow at 0600. You'll lead the electronic warfare element. Plan on a 72-hour turnaround from today's mission for aircraft maintenance and crew rest. He started to leave, then paused at the door. Kira, your call sign. Specter 1. I pulled the full classified file after this morning. I know what happened in Zagros Valley, all of it, including the parts that weren't in the brief. The 6 weeks you spent evading enemy forces. The interrogations you endured before exfiltration. The psychological evaluations that recommended you never fly combat again. Kira's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes acknowledged the truth of his words. Yet here I am, sir. Yet here you are, Hale agreed. And I'm grateful for it, even if I question the wisdom of whoever cleared you to return to flight status. But I need to know, are you okay? Truly okay? Because in 72 hours I'm sending you back into the worst air defense environment in this theater, and I need my electronic warfare lead to be completely reliable. It was a fair question, asked with genuine concern rather than administrative burden. Kira appreciated that. The psychological evaluation said I had trauma responses that would impair performance under stress, she replied carefully. What they actually documented was that I process fear differently than most people. I don't ignore it or suppress it. I convert it into fuel. It makes me sharper, not paralyzed. 3 years ago, I spent 6 weeks behind enemy lines keeping myself alive through situational awareness and discipline. You don't survive that by breaking down. You survive it by becoming very, very good at staying calm when everything is trying to kill you. The answer seemed to satisfy Hale, who nodded once and departed. Kira remained in the debrief room after everyone else had filtered out, staring at the maps and mission data, her mind already working through the next operation. 3 Growlers meant she'd need to coordinate electronic warfare across multiple aircraft, synchronizing jamming to create corridors through the enemy defenses while strike aircraft delivered ordnance. 16 strike birds suggested a mix of capabilities, probably F-15Es for deep penetration, F-16s for suppression of enemy air defenses, maybe some F-35s for their stealth and targeting capabilities. The mission architecture was beginning to take shape in her mind, a complex orchestration of movement and timing where every element depended on every other element. Fail at any point, and the whole package became vulnerable. Execute perfectly, and they'd punch through an air defense network that most militaries would consider impenetrable. It was the kind of challenge that defined careers, Succeed, and your reputation became legend. Fail, and you became a cautionary tale studied in tactical development courses. Over the next 72 hours, Kira worked with an intensity that bordered on obsessive. She met with the other Growler pilots, assessing their capabilities and experience, assigning sectors of responsibility. She coordinated with strike package leads, walking through ingress routes and weapon delivery parameters. She studied intelligence updates obsessively, tracking any changes in enemy radar patterns or dispositions that might indicate they were adapting to the reconnaissance mission's intrusion. Lieutenant Torres, still her assigned weapons systems officer, proved invaluable during planning. His technical knowledge of jamming systems complemented her tactical understanding, and together they developed electronic attack plans that exploited subtle vulnerabilities in enemy radar operating parameters. Other pilots watched them work. This unlikely crew, the legendary Specter one returned from the dead, and the young WSO who'd somehow kept pace with her during combat, and the squadron began to cohere around their competence. Colonel Reeves stopped by the planning cell on the evening before the strike mission, ostensibly to review final details but really to check on Kira. They stood together looking at the mission boards, walls covered with maps and aircraft assignments and timeline breakdowns that reduced hours of complex operations into color-coded blocks. "You know," Reeves said conversationally, "when I first heard Spectre 1 was back, I thought it was a mistake, a case of stolen valor or administrative error. The file said you were permanently grounded, mentally unfit for flight duties." She turned to study Kira with that direct gaze senior officers develop, the one that cuts through pretense to truth. "Now I wonder if that evaluation was less about your mental state and more about protecting you from yourself. From the part of you that can't say no when there's a mission that needs flying." Kira considered the observation without defensiveness. "Maybe," she acknowledged. "Or maybe the evaluators couldn't distinguish between trauma responses and tactical evolution. I'm different than I was before Zagros Valley, more cautious in some ways, more aggressive in others. But different doesn't mean broken." "No," Reeves agreed. "Different means adapted. You became what the situation required. That's not weakness, that's survival evolution." She gestured at the mission boards. "Tomorrow you're leading the most complex strike package this wing has attempted in 2 years. 68 aircraft total when you count tankers and support elements, all depending on you and 2 other Growlers to carve a path through defenses that shot down 3 aircraft last month during a much smaller operation. How do you feel about that?" "Responsible," Kira answered honestly, "and certain that we can succeed if everyone executes their piece. The plan is sound. We've war-gamed the contingencies. The crews are good. What happens tomorrow comes down to execution and whether the enemy does something unexpected." "They always do something unexpected," Reeves noted.